These emerging markets are just the talk of the day. Returns had been extraordinary in every one of these markets, but of course, with high return also comes risk. So could the panel address the question, in their own personal view, in which of these three markets, China, India, and Russia, is the risk-reward ratio most favorable and why? Who would like to take a run at that?
Well, I'll start. We actually evaluated the BRIC countries and decided on India originally. Now, I will say we were biased slightly because half of our team is from India. They were in the United States. We decided to form the fund and go after India real estate. But I don't know enough to compare India to Russia or India to China. I know a little bit more about China than I do Russia, so I would say that when we decided on India, we saw the effect of U.S. multinationals deciding to move their companies, their people, or outsource business to India because of the common language. And we saw that that would be a driver for the next 10 to 15 years. So as opposed to China with the manufacturing, I understand that dynamic. We thought that India, given the common language and some of the relationships we had in India thus far, made it easier for us to choose India over China or Russia or Brazil for that matter.
Who else wants to take a shot at that? Charles?
I'll give you a perspective on,
Mark.
you know, here's my thought on India versus China versus Russia. It's really not as simple as that. It's going to be driven by each specific project you're looking at, each specific investment you're looking at. So, you know, if you tell me, you know, can you go out and invest in Bangalore versus investing in Nanjing, I'm going to say they're both attractive, but it depends on the specific investment, depends on the specific return and the specific structure that you go with, because what's critical in each of these, at least in India, the investment structure is critical. We do look at China, we do look at Russia from our global fund, and that's what we actually do, is we tend to take each of these investments, bubble it up to the top and say, here's the risk-adjusted reward, and that's the return that makes most sense.
That's an excellent answer. In fact, investing globally probably has that specificity in any market. It's the specific deal that matters. So let me take it up a notch and focus on the risk side of the question, because that's something that all three of you are very familiar with. So let me start there. Rather than looking at the ratio of risk versus reward, let's just talk about the risks that are inherent in each of these three emerging markets. I can name a number of them so you can address them. For example, let's start with land title protection or land use protection, 1. How about corruption, 2. How about infrastructure, 3. How about environmental concerns, 4. Let me just throw a few of them out. You guys all know them and more. So what about the risks and how do you mitigate them? And then maybe we'll layer on, as we circle back, the rewards that come with those risks and why it is that all of us here are investing in those markets, notwithstanding this extra layer of risk that seems not to present in some of the Western markets. So let's focus on the risks first. Who wants to take a run at it? Anna?
I'll take a crack at this one for China. I think one of the risks is obviously in China, the government owns the land. That's the first understanding. You're only entitled to land use rights. So to make sure that you actually obtain the proper land use rights is an important part. The registration system up till last year was very chaotic. There was no real way to check proper title, but with the new property law that just came in last year, there is now a better registration system, at least in the major cities. So one thing is just to make sure you actually have the proper right to use the land. The land use rights are limited in time. They're 70 years for residential, less for commercial. So you need to make sure that when you invest in a project, the remaining time on the project is sufficient so that you have your opportunity for return. That's another possible risk. I suppose eminent domain is another one, although that's less risky. China has not been known to, at least for foreign real estate investment, take properties lightly. They have, on a domestic level, fairly often done that. And then there's the question of financial. I think I agree with the gentleman down there, that it is specifically what you are investing in. Right now, high-end real estate is probably, in first-tier cities, is probably not the way to go. In fact, it is being discouraged by the government. But if you go middle income, lower income housing in second-tier cities, there are still opportunities. So it's a whole series of balances.
Thank you. So what you're saying in China, that there are risks with respect to land use, but that risk has been somewhat mitigated by the property law of last year, and the registration is now more efficient, although imperfect. So that's one of the risks. Can we get the panel to address some of the other risks in these other markets?
Maybe corruption is an easy one.
Russia we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're talking about corruption, and when you say emerging markets, you almost by definition are talking about corruption. I know it exists in the entitlement process and all of the purchasing process from start to finish in each of the markets that we're talking about here on the panel. We do business in those markets as well. Different kind of corruption perhaps in each one, but it's very tempting for investors to go in there, or for local investors to do all kinds of things which would definitely violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act if they were brought to light. There's sort of, in each of those places, there's one track to getting entitlements and permitting, and that takes a certain amount of time, which can be somewhere between a longer time than you would want and forever. Or there's the faster track if you're willing to pay somebody to contribute to a school system in their municipality, or things that are a little bit closer to buying them the equivalent of a Ferrari. And I think that what we do about that is we spend a lot of time throwing away projects that are too deeply entrenched in that kind of a solution. We also spend a lot of time on advisors, and basically the money that you might have allocated to speeding up things through corruption, you should really allocate that to having the best people that you can that have those connections already with the government, or for senior advisors that can do things the right way on the up and up and put pressure where there otherwise would have been corruption involved. And certainly when we're investing for large institutional investors, the AIGs of the world, the big Middle Eastern sovereigns and the rest, you know, they can't go anywhere near any of that stuff, and nor would we. So you end up with a lot of frustration. You have to put another 3 to 6 months in all of your permitting processes from what it should take. You have to make sure you spend a lot of time with good advisors on the permitting side, good governmental advisors, et cetera, and sometimes twist some arms of senior bureaucrats to make sure that their junior bureaucrats are not being as corrupt as they would like to be.
Does that twist of the arm include the Ferraris you're talking about?
I think there's sort of, that's the carrot, and unfortunately you have to get a little bit more towards the stick sometimes. In other words, if you've hired somebody who is, we have, for example, on our advisory board, the ex-Minister of Economy of Japan. So that scares what would be Keiretsu members that would be, let's say, in trading companies that are involved with the mafia. These same kinds of things we do in Russia, et cetera. So if you get senior enough people on board that want to be associated with the right names, and they're proud to be, and they want to kind of stamp out some of that corruption in their system, then oftentimes they can make a phone call to make some of that stuff go away. And under Putin, fortunately, one thing that I do like about him, and he's still sort of under control of what's going on from the side, Medvedev is obviously doing a lot of what he wants for him. He's always made it very clear that he wants to stamp out corruption as much as possible. So though he be a bit of a totalitarian, that part of it is good for us.
Just, Carl's, a follow-up, because you're the only Russia expert here. Have you been approached by any with respect to the kinds of things that you say you shouldn't be doing in order to facilitate or grease the wheel on deals? And if so, can you share any of those anecdotes? Undoubtedly, you turned them all down.
Undoubtedly, we turned them all down. Well, I think that I don't get approached as much because I'm pretty high visibility. The way that it would normally happen is your project manager on the ground would have several illusions or late night dinners from construction companies or from mid-level or junior level bureaucrats who give them some ideas on how they could speed up the process. A standard way to couch it in all of these markets is, you know, why don't you pay so-and-so third party a consulting fee, and you don't have to keep track of where it went. That's one of them. Another one is, can you contribute to something within our municipal district? And that's probably a little bit more doable when it's, an allocation of land, or whether you're contributing to a school system or transportation hub or what have you. And then you get some that are just pretty outlandish, and actually, though, I think they make for great cocktail stories. I'm not sure that I want to bring them up here on videotape.
Well, I'll